talking about families that may be somewhat like your families, but maybe quite different. And in fact, one of the things to realize, and I put 6 families from that era up here, we're not going to be talking about the wealthy people. Now, you may be very wealthy. You may be a millionaire. We're not going to be talking about you tonight because that was uncharacteristic of most people in 1860, the very wealthy. And so right away, we're going to eliminate the wealthy family. And then also there were some very impoverished and particularly slave families. We want to recognize they were part of America back then, but I can't expand the program to include them. So we're going to delete, for the moment, the families of the very poor, even as we did the families of the very wealthy, and we're going to focus upon the families, the individuals who lived in the Civil War. Life varied considerably, I'll begin by saying, depending on where you lived. Obviously, if you live today in Maine, it's different than living in Arizona. And America wasn't quite so far stretched back then, but the reality is the climate geography is a given difference that we have today and we have then. Secondly, population density, and we're talking about this. Some people live in cities where there are a lot of people. Some of us like to live in rural areas where there are not so many people, and your everyday life is going to vary depending whether you choose to live in a city or in a suburban or rural area. Immigrants. Now, we talk a lot about this in the news today, but I will tell you it was a big issue back then too, and some areas had a lot of immigrants. We're going to talk about what kind of immigrants they were. Other areas had fewer immigrants, but the percentage, obviously people are coming from the old country, whatever the old country was, they're bringing customs, they're bringing expressions, their everyday life is going to somewhat reflect what they left back in the old country, whatever old country it was. And then the extent of the agrarian economy. What we'll see tonight is about 50% of Americans in 1860 were in farming. Today it's shrunk much less, and many people cannot make a living now in farmers. Of course, we have mega farming going on, but the reality is that if you're living in a farming area, and there were some places in America, like Brooklyn, you weren't much in a farming area back in 1860. Today, most of us do not live in farming areas. I love, by the way, living in this area because this is agriculture. Second to tourism, agriculture is important, and of course also education in this area. Wherever you live, it's going to vary. Population density is interesting. As we look at the map here, some parts of the United States were very dense. You look at, relatively speaking, you look at Massachusetts, you look at Rhode Island, the darker. But you look at Minnesota, look at Arkansas, look at Florida. The density was far less there. And the dark places there is the density over 49 people per square mile. Pennsylvania today, which has a lot of rural area, a lot of woodland, has a density of 284 persons per square mile. So you can see parts of Florida where there were 2 to 6 people per square mile compared to comparable to Pennsylvania. It's a lot different world when you have a lot fewer people in your neighborhood. Also, in terms of the percentage of foreign-born, this is fascinating because what we're seeing is if you live in Minnesota, most of the people there are going to be immigrants, probably from Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, whatnot. Some places in New England as well. Actually, in Texas, there are many who've come in from Mexico, and some places in the depth of Florida, you have people coming in from the Caribbean. But if you're living in Virginia, if you're living in Tennessee, you have very few foreign-born people. Also, key to note here in terms of the percentage is how the North has many more immigrants coming into the United States. Partly because the South was not as welcoming to immigrants at the time, because there wasn't a bottom rung of the ladder for them to get on. Where slavery was practiced, the common work that you would start out with as a day labor was already taken. The ratio of capital investment. Now, we're getting really serious. This is 301 here. This will not be on the final exam, but you should still know about this. Whereas dark, that's going to be more into the industrial, shipping, mining. Whereas lighter, it's going to be more into agriculture. So when you live in America, where are you living in America in 1860? Obviously, if you're living in Massachusetts, you're living in Rhode Island, you're living in Connecticut, a lot of industry, a lot of shipping. If you're living in Missouri, it's going to be much more agricultural. That's going to make a difference where you live as to what it's going to be like. Let's talk about the American population. America, the United States of America, what was it like in 1860? Well, first of all, again, a world apart, let's talk about fertility a little bit. We're not going to go X-rated here, but let's tell, we have people making people, this is fertility. And the average of over 5 children per mother. How many of you mothers? Proud of it? I see those hands, yes. Well, I'm not going to ask how many children you have, but probably you're going to be close to 2. Back in that time, you were 3 times more likely as a young woman to be raising a young child as you would be today. So again, proportionally more children being born. The birth rate today is about a third, again, about the birth rate, well, less than a third than it was back then. All right, we're going to go further into this and recognize how young the population was. Now, I'm more sensitive about this because I'm an old guy now. I'm the old ranger, and I work with young rangers now less than a third of my age. It's really a challenge to keep up with them. But back then, the average age, median age, was 19 years of age, contrasted with 37 years old today. Now, I won't get into the demographics of our audience, but most of you probably are maybe older than 37. But back then, you would have been an old person. Again, the median age was less than 20 years of age. So as you're going about your daily life, you're running into a lot more young people back in 1860 than you would today. In fact, it's interesting as we look to the families. Here's a family from that era. Families were different back then. The family cluster. Let's look at this statistic. 10% of the population then lived alone or with a spouse. Today, 70% of Americans live either alone or with one other person, a spouse. That's a much different situation because back then you were living in groups or clusters. You're probably living with your grandparents, maybe your great-grandparents if they could live that long. And the elderly were living with the family. So senior housing, those things that we take for granted today, we put a place for mom, that didn't exist back then. So the family stayed together pretty much. Once they immigrated to the United States, and often it was the young people who immigrated to the United States, as they got older, their kids pretty much stayed around with them and with a cluster. So any household is going to have not 2 people or 3, it's going to have 6, 7, 8, 9 people or even more people. That was a typical living situation in 1860. Mortality, death. Ooh, hate to deal with this, but you have to deal with it. You cannot talk about the middle of the 19th century without talking about the prominence of death. Now, it may come as a surprise to you, but the ratio of death is the same in terms of 1 person, 1 death. Each of us will face that. However, death was far more frequent and happened a lot sooner back then. For example, many young children were dying. Look at this statistic. I hate to put numbers in. I can't remember numbers. You won't be. But look at that. Per 1,000, 181.3 children were dying every year. Today, only 5. In other words, 32 times as many children of a particular age were dying back then than are dying today. Grief was a very common thing, putting children in a grave. Very common thing in the 1860s, much more today. And I will tell you, I used to be a pastor, and I can tell you, it's very difficult when your children die before you, when life seems to be out of sync, the death of a child. Can you imagine what those people are going through? Abraham Lincoln had lost 2 children and would lose a third. Jefferson Davis losing children. It's a very common thing back then to lose children. In fact, one of the reasons mothers gave birth to so many children is it's so better chance that some would survive. Life expectancy then was 40 years compared to close to 80 today. This is at birth. A child born today is expected to live, on the average, 78 years. At 40, in other words, a child born back there, if you reached 40, you pretty much were getting into old age. And I'm not going to ask you again, I'm not going to take a poll of how many of you have reached 40, but today we think of that, well, you used to think of it maybe as middle age, now we're thinking as just a younger. Actually, the older I get, the whole section of how I view population differs. They say old is 10 years older than what you are. I remember when I was in 5th grade, and just to imagine guys who were 16 just blew my mind. I could ever be that. Well, I won't tell you how old I am now, but I'm old. All right. This is interesting, too, the age pyramid. There used to be a pyramid in terms of this. In other words, you can see that, for example, there were 3 times as many people at 10 as there would be at 30. And then at 60, it's dropped down. Some very, very few might reach the 70 or 80s, and that's called sociologists will call this the age pyramid. We don't live with an age pyramid anymore. Ours looks more like a sort of a skyscraper. The birth to 100, by the way, notice it's going higher and higher and higher. People are getting older and older and older. But the interesting thing about this is there are about as many 60-year-olds as there are 1-year-olds in our population. When you go out, when you go around, it's a whole different thing. If you were 60 in 1860, you were a rare species. Today, again, it's pretty even and doesn't actually start dropping off until the 70s. But this is a whole different thing. Again, the skyscraper on the right, the pyramid on the left. The world in which you're living in 1860 is going to be far different. What we also have to talk about is hygiene and sickness that results from a lack of hygiene, which was very prominent at the time. Serious diseases, what were they at the time? It's interesting, they're not typically the same diseases we face today. Chickenpox, mostly that's controlled. Cholera, pretty well controlled. Diphtheria, pretty well controlled today. Consumption, that's what they called it, we would say TB, well controlled today. Poliomyelitis, fortunately, Dr. Salk, we have that very well controlled today. Measles, you get the MMR inoculation as a kid, pretty well off. And then this is interesting because how did people die then? These diseases, some of which could be fatal. By the way, the post-mortem photographs, they did a lot of pictures of post-mortem. They liked to take pictures of dead people back then, partly to remember them. And there's some are sort of morbid. I've gotten some of the less morbid ones that I'm showing you, but the pictures here are, again, pictures of family members who have died, and they want to remember them. So what are the causes of death? Interesting. First of all, we have TB. I don't know anyone in my lifetime who's died of TB. Some type of disruption of the gastrointestinal tract, dysentery. Diarrhea, by the way, was a soldier's disease from which soldiers died. I don't know anybody who dies from that today. Typhoid fever, pretty well controlled, managed. I don't know if you've ever known anyone who's had that. Pneumonia still is a problem, particularly among older people. You get the fluid in your lungs and the diseased lungs, and it can be death dealing then as now. And I had to work on this one. Puerperal fever. In other words, so many mothers died in childbirth, and you had to have a diagnosis of why they died. And the doctors would say, well, they died of puerperal fever. Nobody today talks about that. This is sort of a made-up thing that the doctors had. And one of the diseases was old age. If you got over 50 and you died, well, it was your time. That's what they would say. That was the cause of death, old age. Now we're more specific. When you die, believe me, there's going to be on your death certificate something a little more specific than old age, even though you might be old. The interesting thing here, heart disease and cancer, those two things which we most deal with today, common today, rare back then. Less than 2%, about 2% of deaths in the 1860s were caused by either heart problems, cardiovascular problems, or cancer, which is so prevalent today. The world was very much different when it came to disease. And of course, often the way disease is transferred is because of a lack of hygiene, a lack of consideration for what needs to be done. Health concerns, oh my goodness. Pigs roam freely pretty much around and nauseating fumes. We'll talk about this. I think one of the most different things about 1860 than today would be the smells. Absolutely repulsive smells all around. I think you get used to a repulsive smell if you live long enough around it. Anybody from Tyrone, Pennsylvania here? Be careful. There was a paper factory there. Every time I drive through, you'd hold your nose. But people there couldn't smell it anymore. And rats and cockroaches, including not only most dwellings, but also they would indwell the White House. So again, you just got accustomed to it. Now, you might have an occasional cockroach and you deal with it, but it was a common thing. You didn't think anything. You see a cockroach running across the carpet or the road. That's just part of life. You didn't worry about that. And this startled me when I realized, I did some calculating the mortality rate, the death rate in New York City in 1860 was like medieval London. Remember when they had the Black Plague and bubonic plagues and things like that in medieval London? It was a serious problem, largely because of a lack of hygiene. And indeed, what did you do with your garbage back then? Today we put it in a container. Today the garbage truck comes along. Think about the garbage you create. What happens is that people just tossed it out, maybe in their backyard, maybe in the alley, maybe even in the front street. In fact, as you walked along, you had to be careful in case somebody was throwing something out the window when it landed on you. By the way, putrid smells, you can begin to understand that. These photographs actually are post-Civil War, but show garbage, which in some cities has just absolutely overwhelmed them. Notice you have 4 or 5 feet deep in garbage on the streets because garbage trucks aren't collecting the garbage. This is a serious matter, and again, how putrid it would have been. The hygiene back then, when you have all this terrible stuff going on. And the smoke. Oh my goodness, the smoke. I'm from Pittsburgh area originally. The Pittsburgh is shown up top, and then Allegheny City, which has merged with Pittsburgh subsequently. The smoke from the steamships, the smoke from the factories, the smoke from the chimneys, smoke, terrible smoke. Smog, we've later on called it when industry added much to it, but you're often choking. If you're living in the city, the smoke is terrible. Stench and smoke, typical every day. And I'm not sure, I won't take a poll as to who's ever used one of these. So we do have porta-johns here, by the way, if you need to make your way back there, that's fine. But privies, outhouses, not pleasant places, but again, every human being has to relieve himself, herself, and so you have a variety. These are city privies, by the way. We joke about the outhouses in the country, but remember, not only are farmers, but people in the cities have to use these too. And I found interesting, this actually is post-Civil War, but sanitary privies are cheaper than coffins because of all the disease which is spread in those things. So this is very unpleasant, and I apologize, but I can't be honest in telling you about what life was like without telling you it was pretty disgusting. It was pretty disgusting. For most people, bathing did not occur as we do it today. No showers, no bathtubs. You might have a tub that you might bathe in, but the most common thing, in fact, they thought that if you bathed, somehow you would disrupt and infect maybe the pores of your body. So very commonly, instead of bathing, was what was called a dry wash. Dry washing using a linen towel, and that's how people would wash, and maybe once a week. Did I mention about the stench, by the way? Body odor is going to be an issue. And I think if you were immediately now transplanted back to 1860, the first thing would be you would hold your nose, the stench and everything. And of course we can see that because people they have no sense of hygiene. They might jump in a creek if you're a kid, if you're a kid, and maybe in this case she is actually, with the aid of someone else, perhaps a family member, is doing a bathing in a very small pail, and that's probably high level. You might clean your teeth. How? Well, most people didn't, but if you did, you'd have a toothbrush made of pig bristles, and if you needed help on that, chalk or soot. I'm not recommending this, people. Please do not try this at home. But the reality is, trying to get the bad taste out of their mouth, they try different things. There was a new dentifrice out, not toothpaste. Toothpaste in a tube that you're so familiar with did not exist. But during the 1850s, toothpaste in a jar was developed, a little bit better than soot to use on your teeth, but still not a pleasant thing at all. One of the most common things used was Brandis pills. Pretty safe to consume. There was really no problem with Brandis, but they were well marketed and well advertised. The one thing about them, however, is that they are ineffective at doing anything. You might as well be chewing on candy as taking one of these pills. Tonics, oh my goodness. Snake oil salesmen. Very common. They had tonics for anything and everything, no matter what ails you. In fact, some tonics claim to cure almost everything. And these are on the market, and some look very legitimate. That dear lady on the right, Lydia Pinkham's, her blood medicine, it does contain alcohol, 50% alcohol. Well, maybe it's not so bad after all, I don't know. But recommended for different conditions and for impure blood, whatever that is. These snake oil salesmen and the tonics that they had were very bad. And in fact, not only tonics for adults, but Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. Very commonly sold, very commonly used by mothers, especially for teething. You've had a situation where the baby cries and moans because of that. Magical medicinal remedies, but look, it contained morphine and alcohol for a baby. This is not a good thing. I'm sure mothers thought they were doing the right thing back then to use Mrs. Winslow's. But again, there's a lot of stuff out there that really was not helping your health, not helping your hygiene. And one of the sad, very almost tragic stories is how children were being poisoned by well-meaning mothers. Talk about clothing. And one of the interesting things as you grow old is that you can look back to eras, the 1970s, how people dressed, the 1950s, how people dressed. And it's fascinating. I used to think everything comes back around. That's why I keep all my ties, because they get wide and they get thin, they get short, they get colorful, they get dull, and then it comes back wide and thin, whatever. But the interesting thing is the clothing back then was very, very simple. And in fact, you're lucky to have had more than one or two pieces of clothing, actually changes of clothing. Children were dressed alike regardless. In fact, I have a photograph in my home. My father was just 1906 in Oklahoma Territory, and he was dressed in he dressed like a girl. That was very common throughout the 19th century. You couldn't tell by looking at a baby or even a toddler whether or not it was a boy or a girl, because they dressed them all alike. Now, I will tell you, now we go to pink and blue and whatnot. By the way, pink used to be the boys' color, the baby boys' color. Things change. Stay around long enough, it changes. And the reality is most children were wearing hand-me-downs. Now they don't fit, but what you do is you restitch them to make them fit from mother's old garment that she's gotten rid of. And so many of the girls simply have one dress that they wear all the time, and it's made out of the material that their mother's dress had been made out of. Very fortunate if they have a Sunday go-to-meeting dress, but very common, children just wearing hand-me-downs. Another thing at night, your second garment, your second change of clothing is probably what you're going to wear at night. Crisp, thick cotton. And it's interesting as we think about this. Nightcaps, by the way, jelly bags they were called, but you lose more heat out of your head than any other way of your body. And if you're going to bed, you don't have a thermostat, you don't have a furnace. They didn't have them back then. To keep warm in the night, you had to keep your head covered. And so they would have these, and you can see the illustration of women in these nightcaps. And you know this. You know this because what? When Mom in her kerchief and I in my cap settle down, when Christmas Eve, they're wearing those things. That's what you wear when you go to bed. Now, I have not seen any of you go to bed. Well, my wife's here tonight, but otherwise I've never seen any, and my son's here tonight. With those two exceptions, I've never seen any of you go to bed to see whether you ever wear a hat or not. So, well, whatever. Garments. Let's talk about garments for ladies. And quickly, by the way, let's look under the garments, and we're going to try to do it as best way we can, because there were unmentionables. Now, men were not supposed to know about all this, so I'm letting you guys in on a secret. Drawers, corsets, pantalettes, chemises, camisoles, petticoats, bloomers, crinoline cages. Underneath that beautiful flowing dress, if she could afford that beautiful flowing dress with a hoop skirt, are all these layers. In fact, the reality is there were as many as 7 layers underneath. It took quite a while. It could take an hour to get dressed, and here we have hubby trying to get his wife ready to go out for an evening together. It's a different world today. The women's garments were complicated, absolutely complicated. And I'll just mention that when my wife and I used to do Victorian dancing, and I could get ready in 15 minutes. when she got ready, in fact, one of the problems was I couldn't get her in the car because her hoop skirt was so big. It was a different kind of thing. So very complicated what women had to go through if they could afford this. Now, we're talking about, we would say, upper middle class women here. And in fact, a woman's dream was to be able to one day have, oh my goodness, low neck. Oh, this is, by the way, not something you would have seen in the 1840s, but in the 1860s, you might see the lower neck and falling off the shoulders, the skirt, bell-shaped, short sleeves trimmed in lace. That was the big thing. And comfortable shoes for dancing. If you're going to do the Virginia reel, do the waltz. Now, most people aren't doing waltzes, but you aspire one day, oh, if my husband can learn the steps and if he can get wealthy enough, maybe we can go to a ball where I can do the waltz. So women's clothing was this, but men's clothing was far more simple. Men almost always wore suits, virtually always wore suits, heavier, coarser fabrics if you weren't in the cities, and suspenders, braces. Leather belts were coming in fashion, but in the West, on the frontier. Many men, I always wear belts today, but suspenders or braces were most common thing back then. And white shirts, if possible. Often you had starched collars or collars which were removable, so it looked like it was a clean shirt, but actually it's just a collar. And then men wore felt hats typically. Now, there were beaver hats, there were silk hats. Those were very expensive and probably not that. But every man, no matter whether he was a banker or just a common laborer, would probably have a suit, or try to have a suit, or at least aspire to have a suit. That would be for men. How did you earn a living back then? Now, today, if you go check with your neighbors, one may be a tax accountant, another may be a gym teacher in school, another might be the fire chief or whatever not. Back then, who would your neighbors been like? What would they been like? How did you earn a living back then? Again, 50% of Americans were in farming. I'm just curious, how many of you have ever been in farming? I see one hand, 2 hands, 3 hands. Thank you. We need farmers. Let's appreciate our farmers. But can you imagine back then, half the crowd would raise their hands. Farming was so very important. But what would have been, other than farming, your neighbor's vocation? Well, let's look at a bunch of these. We have iron workers. We have surveyors. That's important still today. We have shoemakers. Now, there makes these factories today. We have peddlers, if they don't have a store around. You have coopers. They make barrels, which are very important. You have blacksmiths. And here we have a latchmaker. Latches, of course, you have doors, cabinets you need latches for. Your neighbor might be a sheep herder, tender of sheep. He might be a coal miner. Might be a cowboy. By the way, not nearly as romantic as Hollywood has made it. Teamsters, driving horses, carriages very commonly. A wheelwright, making wagon wheels, which there had to be many of them. Cigar worker. Cigars are still made and usually imported now, but cigar worker would be common. A whaler, if you're from New England, that was still very important. A photographer, and this is a brand new profession, very interesting, but people like to get their pictures made. One of the reasons we have so many pictures is that you wanted to get your picture made. The interesting thing is nobody very much smiles in their photographs. It's not like they're having much fun in the 1860s, although we'll see a vocation seem to have some fun as we get on. Oh, here's another one, Iceman. They actually were able to save ice from the lakes in the winter and then keep it in ice houses and chop it up and then distribute it. Here's a lumberjack, of course, particularly in Minnesota, Michigan, you would have that. Storekeeper, store clerk, very common thing, of course, back then. Chimney sweep, if you're a kid and could squeeze up a chimney, you could be a chimney sweep. A butcher, we still have those, although not like it was in those days. Grist miller, of course, the wheat has to be ground up. And we see a sailor. Of course, if you're on the coastal area, you'd have sailors. Go on, a few more occupations. Here's a trapper, of course, particularly on the frontier. A day laborer, a sheriff, of course, that's in the west, but also in the east. A preacher, that was a vocation some could do. A stage actor, they didn't have Hollywood actors, but stage actors. And then the smile, here comes the smile. Brewery workers. Somebody liked what they did at the time anyway. But you can see just a variety of things. And most of these are not the kind of jobs your neighbor is going to have today. Although we have a new brewery in town. We actually have several breweries in town. So maybe we're going to reinvent the past here in Gettysburg. But we have to ask, what about women? What were they doing? Because those all were men jobs that we talked about. What will women do? Well, let's see. You could be a domestic, in other words, a maid. You might be a seamstress. That was very important for clothing. You might be a laundress, also very important because you got to try to keep that pair of clothes clean. A nun. Many people ladies went off to nunneries. Might be a governess. That's going to be a pretty exclusive job. Here's a school teacher. We're going to talk about school teachers more in a minute. And then you might have some other things. But let's talk about school teacher in particular. I want to quote what a school board in Massachusetts did. They said, God seems to have made women particularly suited to guide and develop the infant mind. I can handle that, but then listen. It seems poor policy to pay a man $20 or $22 a month for teaching children when a woman, a female, can do it more successfully at 1/3 the price. Yeah, now I'm giving history. I'm not advocating something here, but the reality is when women did get a job, they usually weren't paid very much for it back then, not at all. And manufactories were beginning, which we would now call factories. And this is particularly in New England, women into textiles, shoemaking, and other things, where mass production was occurring. This is a new concept, and it has not yet got to this area, and most of the United States did not have manufactories. This is not a good thing as it continues to develop in the post-Civil War era, and very grueling work, dangerous work, and not paid well. Talk about schooling a little bit. You ever been to school? Probably so. Well, let's talk about schooling back then. First of all, most children didn't go to school. Less than 50% of children at the time attended school. Only Massachusetts had compulsory. One-room schoolhouse, you know about that. We have several left in this area. Students advance at their own pace. It's called the Lancastrian system. The Lancastrian system is older kids teaching younger kids, and the teachers sort of overseeing it all, the Lancastrian system. So you don't have a first grade, second grade, fifth grade. That didn't exist back then. Memorization, recitation was emphasized. I don't memorize well, and as a result, I would have done very poorly in that one-room schoolhouse. I probably would have been paddled many a times. I was actually paddled twice. You don't do this anymore in school, but I come from an era where paddling was permitted, and I was twice paddled. Won't get into the details. Age ceilings were not set. Typically, if your kid reached 12 years of age, you took him out of school if he had even been in school. So again, this is a typical school situation. And by the way, you didn't have meals at school, so they went to school about 10 in the morning. They're out at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 hours, and there's no meal at school. So they head home, they have a breakfast, and they come home for a supper meal. They didn't have lunchtime meal at school, no cafeteria, no of the things that we're so accustomed to in schools today. And here's some period illustrations, including the guy with the dunce cap on the bottom. That would have been me, but they'd gotten rid of dunce caps by the time I came along. This is interesting. In 1850, the percentage of population attending school, notice how thin it was in the South and how thick it was in most of the North. There was a different perspective in the cultures in the North and the South as far as education. Now, if you were wealthy in the South, if you had a plantation or something, you would have your children educated, particularly your sons, and often send them to colleges in the North, which was not uncommon. In fact, Pennsylvania College here in the town of Gettysburg had a number of Southern students who would come up here. But for the most part, education was not considered important in the culture of the South. And school books always had moral lessons. McGuffey's Reader upper left, and then even Anderson, the Grimm's Fairy Tales. There were lessons to be taught. It wasn't just a fantasy story like is very popular with kids today, which had no real. What are youth, by the way? And what were youth at the time? This is a very fascinating thing because youth has changed its concept from what it was then and what it is now. First of all, child discipline was a very strict thing. Not that there was an absence of love by the father, but corporal punishment was very common, being taken to the woodshed. And I won't ask how many of you were. I was taken to the woodshed. But the break the will of the wayward child. Now, of course, we're concerned with child abuse issues. Youth had a broad span of meaning. In fact, it really varied. In fact, for sometimes kids were considered youth when they were in their 20s, and others, at the onset of puberty, were no longer considered youth. But they didn't have the anxiety period that we have today, the uncertainty. Adolescence, which we talk about, didn't occur later. Why didn't it happen? Well, the reality is, in 1860, you didn't have any choices. You knew exactly what you were going to do. You didn't go off to college to learn something. You didn't ponder what I might do with my life. You were told what you were going to do, and probably was going to fall in your father's footsteps. And so very strict, and as a result, the adolescence that we're concerned about is something of a modern era. It's not something of the 1860s. Courtship is interesting, and it was well regulated. If you became mature, you were supposed to start thinking about marriage. There wasn't this in-between period, the teenage years that we talk about today. And this handbook talks about etiquette as far as how you should act, and very strict. How courtship was done was a very strict thing, and usually under mother or grandmother's observation, maybe father's observation, how it was done, maybe in group settings, but not dating. There was no such thing as dating back then in the 1860s. And by the way, if you never did get hitched, you were called a spinster as a woman. And undesirable considered at marrying age. It's very unfortunate. It's a stigma which shouldn't have been there for whatever reason, but they had spinsters back there. We don't have spinsters. Hearth and home, very important. What is your life like back where you live, back in home? First of all, your house could have been any different variety of appearances. We have a number in Gettysburg, of course, historic homes, some federal, but depending on where you are in the nation, your home varied in appearance. For those without servants, and most did not, the children had essential chores. What are the children doing? Well, caring for younger siblings, just like in the school, we're caring for the younger. Helping with the laundry, that's an ordeal that they would have to do. Assisting in preparation of meals, maybe peeling the potatoes. Gathering wood, which is going to have to be used in the stove. Tending sheep, if you're going to have sheep, and many did. Collecting eggs, you're going to go out and get them from the chickens, that's a common thing. And feeding the hens and picking berries, if the berries happen to be in season. Boys did domestic work only until they were old enough to work with their fathers in the fields typically. So in the early years, maybe 6, 7, 8 years of age, they were doing side by side, brother and sister, and then the boy's getting strong enough, big enough to work in the fields, and he's out of the house and he's not doing these things much anymore. But there is a troubling new thing developing in the 1860s, and that is child labor outside the home, and whether it be as a chimney sweep into factories now, as manufactories are growing, in coal mines and other places. This is a very alarming thing, and it's going to get worse, my friends, as we get on into the 19th century. If you came from British ancestry, or Scottish, Irish, something like that, you had the hearth, which was the fireplace, which is a place where you gathered, warned people. Smoke was an annoyance, and smoke, remember we talked about in the streets, but smoke in the house is a problem, and fire a danger. So if you could afford it, you would put your kitchen, have a summer kitchen out, so if things got fire, the whole house isn't going to burn down. Summer kitchen is very common. You can go out to the George Spangler farm here at Gettysburg, and allowed to do that on the weekends through the foundation. You can see the summer kitchen, the outside kitchen, which was being used there. The iron stove was more from a German and the continental basis, but the kitchen becomes a center of activity and the hub of activity. The most active place in the house would be the kitchen. And again, the cast iron stove, very important for heating the house as well as for cooking and for all the things that are going to be needed. Very difficult, by the way, because the reality is you can't maintain the proper heat. It varies. It's not like the ranges and stoves and things we have today where you can control the heat. So you're going to burn the muffins, whatever, or maybe the meat's not going to be properly cooked. That's always a problem for the mother as she's trying to do it. Ice delivery, we talked about that, and you actually had ice boxes. And I've known people who actually referenced ice boxes, and that's used to be the way it was before you had an electric refrigerator. You had an ice box, and actually even common folk, not just wealthy people, would have ice delivered to their home. As far as the menu, bread was the staple for meals, the most common thing. Meat was typically mostly on Sunday or special meals. You didn't have meat every day as Americans typically have today. Stews and soups, why were they common? It's because they're leftovers. Whatever leftovers you have, you put together in some kind of mush. Of course, you have no refrigerator per se. You have the ice box, but you do have a root cellar, so you can keep some things from the harvest, which are down in the root cellar. And look at all these food marvels, by the way. These are interesting. New things. Wow. Astounding. What do we have? Graham crackers. Wow. Some of you had graham crackers tonight. Self-rising flour, that was a real good godsend. Condensed milk, first time ever. Granola. Tabasco, that's good. I can't imagine living without that. Canned pork, canned vegetables. Now, canning was a new thing and not always done well, but it was a marvelous, exciting new thing. Fleischmann's compressed yeast. I don't understand what that's all about, but you women may have that if you understand the importance of that. And Necco wafers. By the way, did you see in the news? They almost went out of existence because they're not as popular, nearly as popular as peanut butter cups or something like that. But the first real children's candy was the Necco wafer. And you still can occasionally get them. I've not been able to get them. I was going to have them tonight. We have s'mores instead, and they're actually better. But Necco wafers was the candy, and kids loved that candy when they had that opportunity to have that. Meals had prescribed features. In other words, every meal was pretty much set as to how it was going to happen. Not the catch as catch can we have typically today in terms of meals. Breakfast, most commonly porridge, maybe Johnny cakes with eggs and milk, maybe a small beer they call it. Leftover meat and bacon, you're fortunate if you had something left over from Sunday dinner that you could also have then. Supper was the midday meal. At a certain time each day, it might be 2 o'clock in the afternoon. You remember the kids get out of school at 2 o'clock. And father always sat facing the door. This is a common thing from the old country. Set places at the table, usually the eldest son with the right of the father. And mother wasn't necessarily at the table. Now, she was very busy during the meal, but it's really part of the unfortunate aspect of the time that women did not have the same role at the table. And of course, dinner was a more extensive meal. Special days, of course, Thanksgiving. Well, Thanksgiving actually comes after, it's 1860, but more extensive meal. So you had breakfast, supper. I don't see lunch on there. They didn't understand lunch. I don't see bedtime snack on there, do you? Well, so things have changed. My, have they changed. And by the way, the wife, she was under the rule of her father as a child and as a youth, and then she came under the rule of her husband. He was the provider, and so women had very little in the way of rights at the time. Women were legally, economically dependent, and a woman without that, you had a few spinsters that may have inherited money, but typically women were completely subservient at the time, and very few were actually educated unless you were well-to-do. They had finishing schools for women, but women weren't supposed to think much of anything. It was a different time, a different age. Let's talk about some fun things. Recreation. What do you do for fun? Well, dolls, of course, were very popular then. Less popular now, but very popular for the children. And paper dolls, very commonly also, a lot cheaper than the other dolls. In fact, they made dolls out of socks and about everything. Well, what do we have here? We have building blocks. Okay, still it. We have a rocking horse. Now, hoop rolling, that was very popular. Jumping rope, that's still somewhat as popular among kids. Spinning tops, that was a game. Pull toys, we still have those somewhat for our kids. Climbing trees, I loved that as a kid. That was recreation. The cat's cradle, using these strings and things in different ways to make funny things. The clapping games, and some girls today still do the clapping games, a patty cake kind of thing. Shuttlecocks, which is sort of like badminton. Dominoes, very popular then, continues to be popular among some. Ring toss, which was also called graces. Girls would do that. Playing tag, of course, kids have always done that. They did that in the 1860s. Parlor games became very popular. We could have an hour program just on the parlor games that they played, but very popular. Sometimes the kids were allowed to play a little bit, and sometimes they were sent to bed. And in quoits, you may have played quoits. It was a simple thing you could put together, and could do it indoors or outdoors. 9 pins, not 10 pins, but 9 pins of bowling with a small ball, and you just set it up outside your house. Stilts, I had stilts as a kid. Playing hide and seek, I hope that hasn't gone away. Kite flying, that was popular then, still somewhat. Shooting marbles, less popular now. It was popular when I was a kid, but very popular in the 1860s. Another thing which you have a sort of a thing you throw up and try to catch, a billabong, was popular among kids. Yo-yo, well, that's still sometimes seen. Knuckle bones, sometimes used, and actually that could be used for gambling as well. I don't see any digital games here like that. I don't see any computer games. And in fact, today's kids, well, they would have puzzles. I had Gilbert puzzles as a kid. They were fun. Card playing was then very popular. Among some, still is popular today among kids and adults. Checkers, Less so today. We have very few checker players, but back then a very common thing. Fox and geese, sort of like Chinese checkers, was a game that they would play. Crack the whip, a very famous Winslow Homer painting, kids just cracking a whip at school. And jack straws, you may recognize that. Pick up sticks, different names given to that. And then for men, horse racing was very popular. By the way, you know, behind the Hotel Gettysburg in town is Racehorse Alley. Why is it called Racehorse Alley? It goes to a parking lot because that's where the men would race their horses in Gettysburg. And that was a very popular thing, and of course they're going to be betting on that as well. Men would also be involved in baseball, and we do have period baseball tournament every summer around here. Really fun, and soldiers in the Civil War would take this game that they learned at home and they would bring it and play it in the ranks. Poker, recreation, but also could be a loss of funds for pretty easily. Horseshoes, which we still sometimes today, and mumbly peg, which is not something I recommend. Again, some of these things, do not try these at home. Mumbly pegs where you're throwing knives at feet and very dangerous kind of thing. So I'm not recommending this at all. What about women again? Well, women had recreation, although it was almost always purposeful, not just to have fun, but they would have quilting bees. They would do dainty work, as they called it. Dainty work would you have things like here's a feather fan that they would put together, or hair work. They would take hair and curl it around and put it in little capsules or something to wear it as brooches or whatnot. Music is an interesting part. It's always part. It's very popular today, obviously, music, and you watch on television, see who's won the voice competition, whatnot. Music was very popular back then. Different kind of music. Let's talk about what was popular. First of all, minstrels. It was the rage. By the way, minstrels, because often blackface, that's not something that's often done. Stephen Foster, very popular. You know, his tunes, he was from Pittsburgh, but wrote, in other words, in the Kentucky Derby, you don't hear his songs much anymore. Dixie was a very popular hymn at the time, and it was written by a guy from Ohio, and it was popular north and south. It became a battle cry in the south, but it was very popular around the nation. And David Gilmour had led the way, and many communities developed their own bands. And so if you had a community, a little town, you wanted to get a band, and you would get together, and they would play often on the town square. And then the Southern Harmony, shape notes, and you probably all heard the tune Amazing Grace. That came out the same time period and very often sung, and easy to sing and sometimes sung in refrain. That's the kind of music was popular. Music was very, very popular then. I don't think it's even more popular today as it was then. It's just a different type of music, a different way. Merchandise, if you're going to buy things, you're not going to get on the web. You're not going to get Amazon to send it to you. You're going to have a dry goods store and do it. And the interesting thing is usually the men who did the shopping back then in these stores, because they would go not only to buy things, but they would go to chit-chat, to talk politics, maybe to play checkers on the Cracker Barrel, maybe also to get the latest rumors that were there. Shopping often done where men, as the way would socialize and talk politics, so men were more often seen in the stores than the women were. There were no pricing marked, so you talked to the storekeeper and said, "What I'd like this. Well, let me see how much," and he would barter with you. And maybe, depending on how good a customer you were, he might lower the price. So it was bartering was very common back then. And most customers shopped on credit. You didn't actually pay so much at the time. So it was very important for the storekeeper to keep track and to judge whether or not you were going to be a good risk. If you come from out of town, show up, he may not give you that credit. But if you're local, often it was on credit. But they didn't have credit cards. It was just he would keep a tally there at the store, and maybe every month you'd pay it off. If you lived far from a store, there would be peddlers, and they'd go peddling their goods from door to door, wherever it might be. Religion becomes very, very important, and it's interesting compared to what it had been and compared to what it will become. Particularly with this chart, notice the blue are the Methodists. Notice how they've come out of almost nowhere. Look how the Baptists have grown. We have in the early period of our nation, of course, particularly the Congregationalists and Episcopalians. But by 1860, notice, most everyone who were members of churches were members of Methodist or Baptist churches. But the other interesting thing, and I find this so curious, many more would attend church than would actually join. What we have today is that many people join churches, but they don't go to worship services. Sort of the opposite thing. So Abraham Lincoln became very faithful the last 2 years of his life, but he never joined a church, and that was a pretty common thing. was sort of unusual to join a church. But again, you can see in the growth and the change, the Baptists and Methodists became very, very prominent. And with that, Sunday school, by the way, which still is prominent in many places, Sunday school was very important as an education. Remember, public education was very limited. So often Sunday school wasn't just teaching Bible stories, it was teaching kids how to read, and it was giving moral lessons as well. Sunday school would be very important. But there's another side of society besides church, and those were the pubs, the taverns, the beer houses, and they were very popular and very many. I have a friend who is a licensed guide who's done a study of the pubs of Adams County, and there were a lot of them around here. What do? Well, you socialize, maybe dancing, maybe playing games, maybe hearing the news being told, maybe betting, a lot of betting, especially we talked about on horse racing, what may happen. There were fun places, but sometimes things would get out of hand. In fact, the downside, here were some illustrations, spirit illustrations of people were getting drunk, they're drinking too much. And there was a famous play that came out shortly thereafter about, I think it was 9 Nights in a Bar Room or something like that. And my mother said that they, in the early 20th century, she acted in that play because they're talking about the downside of these places where men are getting inebriated. What you're reading is going to be important. If you can read, some people couldn't read, but if you could read, of course, you got newspapers, and newspapers would come out. Sometimes they come out several times a day in different editions. Here you hear it, get the next person, and they would call out selling newspapers. So you bought a paper at 10 o'clock in the morning, you might buy paper at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Newspapers, very, very important, daily newspapers, and every city had multiple newspapers, not like we have today. And you also have journals, particularly journals, famously Harper's Weekly and Frank Leslie's Illustrated, which were illustrated journals. And then you have, for the highbrow, the Atlantic Monthly, and for the women, they had their own journal, which is Godey's Lady Book. Very, very popular, where women would aspire to what they might wear and the balls that they might attend. And the pictures, these illustrations from Godey's indicate, and for the most part, it was a dream and stories of romance, whatnot. Very popular magazine, a journal for women. I'm going to come to a conclusion here. We're getting dark and getting final, but the fire has done very well tonight, hasn't it? Let's hear it for the fire. That's one of the best fires I've ever seen here, and I had nothing to do with it tonight. But anyway, I want to end with something which is special to me, and that are pets. Fewer pets then than we have now, but they were pets. And indeed, the reality is that if you could, now sometimes you had dogs which were used for herding, you had cats who were mousers, you had the animals around that had specific key purposes that you depended upon. But the reality is, as we see in this next picture, and this is my final picture, I love the fact that people who are getting the portraits made wanted someone special to be in the portrait with them. Not often the cats. I had a hard time coming up with cat pictures. Maybe the cats are not cooperating, but we have dog pictures, and not that many people had pets, but the ones that did have pets really loved them. So what we've seen here is, again, is a world apart from what we know today, the world on the cusp of the Civil War, and one of the big differences is the stench, the body odor, the smoke, the garbage, all those things, which fortunately we do not have to put up today. But it's fascinating to put yourself back in history. If you were to go back in history, 1860, before this war broke out and before all the fighting and all that we talk about in other battle walks and other campfires, what was it like? And maybe you have a better handle now than you had when you came. What was it like for probably your ancestors who lived here in 1860? What was their life like? It was a world apart from what you know now. Thank you very much.